The morning I found the second cell phone, I almost convinced myself there was a reasonable explanation. I had been married for 12 years. 12 years of Sunday grocery runs and shared Netflix passwords, and knowing exactly how my husband took his coffee. 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk, heated to exactly the right temperature because he hated when it got too hot. I knew that, man. Or I thought I did. The phone was tucked inside the breast pocket of a suit jacket I had pulled from the back of our closet to drop off at the dry cleaner. A slim prepaid phone, the kind you buy at a gas station. No passcode. Just sitting there like it belonged. I set it on the bathroom counter and stared at it for a long time before I opened it. I wish I hadn't, but I also know that if I hadn't, I would have kept living inside a lie that was already suffocating me, and I just didn't know it yet. My husband and I had met at a work conference in Denver. I was 26, just promoted to junior account manager at a marketing firm. He was 31, charming, sharp, the kind of man who made every conversation feel like the most important one in the room. We dated for 2 years, got engaged on a hiking trip in Sedona, married the following October in a small ceremony in Vermont, surrounded by fall leaves and people we loved. For the first few years, life felt full. We bought a house in the suburbs of Charlotte. I changed jobs twice and eventually landed somewhere stable. He climbed steadily in his field, commercial real estate, steady commissions, a small team he managed. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. We took vacations. We talked about kids, then decided against them, then talked about it again. We had a dog named Biscuit who slept at the foot of the bed and made everything feel more like home. I want to be honest. Our marriage wasn't perfect. No marriage is. The last 2 years had been harder. He worked longer hours. We fought about small things, whose turn it was to deal with the plumber. Why the savings account was lower than we'd planned. But I thought we were going through a rough patch. Every couple does. I never thought we were going through an ending. The warning signs were there. I see that now. He had started sleeping with his phone face down on the nightstand. He took calls in the garage, twice. I noticed he'd been logged out of our shared family calendar. When I asked, he said work had gotten complicated. Client confidentiality, restructuring. I nodded. I believed him. That Tuesday morning, I held that prepaid phone and scrolled through the messages with hands that had gone completely cold. There were hundreds of them. Months of them. Her name was saved as L. The messages were not ambiguous. They were not fraught. Friendly. They were not something I could explain away or rationalize or let myself misread. I set the phone back down on the counter, walked into the kitchen, and sat at the table for almost an hour. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just sat there, watching the neighbor's dog run across the yard next door, thinking about how completely ordinary everything looked from the outside. When my husband came downstairs that morning, he poured himself a cup of coffee and asked what I wanted to do for dinner. I looked at him. I thought about 12 years. I thought about the hiking trip in Sedona and the Vermont leaves, and every conversation we'd ever had about the future. Then I slid the phone across the counter. He went very still. That moment, the silence that followed, is the one I keep coming back to. Not the messages themselves, not what happened next. Just that silence, and the way he looked at that phone, and how I knew in an instant that the man across the counter from me was not the person I had believed him to be. He didn't deny it. I'll give him that. Some people do. Some people stand in the wreckage they created and still insist they didn't start the fire. He just set down his coffee mug, rubbed the back of his neck, and said, "I was going to tell you." I asked how long. He said 8 months. I later found out it had been closer to 2 years. He told me he wasn't happy, that he hadn't been happy for a while, that he didn't know how to bring it up, that he was sorry. He used the word sorry 4 times in 6 minutes, which is the kind of thing you start counting when your brain is desperately looking for something solid to hold on to. I asked him to leave. He didn't argue. He packed a bag that same afternoon, 2 suitcases and a box of miscellaneous things from his office. He took Biscuit's food bowl by accident and texted me an hour later to say he'd drop it back. That detail crushed me in a way I didn't expect. The dog bowl. Everything else I had somehow held together, and then the dog bowl nearly broke me. He moved into a short-term rental downtown. I stayed in the house. I wandered through the rooms for 3 days eating cereal and not sleeping, and trying to understand how 12 years could fit inside 8 months of text messages to someone named L. On the fourth day, I called my sister. She drove down from Raleigh that same evening. She showed up at my door with a bag of groceries, a bottle of wine, and an expression on her face that told me she was prepared to be angry on my behalf for as long as necessary. She sat across from me at that same kitchen table and let me talk until 2 in the morning. At some point, she said something I didn't fully understand until weeks later. She said, "You need to find out what you don't know yet." I thought she meant emotionally. She meant financially. My sister is a paralegal. She doesn't panic easily. She also doesn't sugarcoat things, which is exactly what I needed, even though it hurt. She asked me whether I had looked at our joint accounts recently, whether I knew the state of our retirement savings, whether there were any assets I didn't have direct access to. I hadn't looked, not carefully. I trusted him because I thought that was what you did in a marriage. You divided responsibilities. He handled most of the financial accounts because he was better with numbers. I handled the household logistics because I was more organized. It felt like a fair split. It wasn't a naive arrangement. It was just ours. But that night, with my sister sitting across from me, I opened the laptop and started looking. What I found took the floor out from under me a second time. Over the past 22 months, a total of $43,000 had been transferred out of our joint savings account in increments small enough not to trigger automatic alerts. 2,000 here, 1,500 there. Some months, nothing, then a larger transfer that still stayed just under the threshold. Patient. Methodical. Like someone who had thought carefully about how not to be noticed. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. My sister put her hand on my arm and said, "Don't transfer anything. Don't close anything. Don't touch it. Tomorrow, you call a divorce attorney." I did. Her name was Ms. Patricia Hollins. She had an office in Uptown Charlotte, a firm handshake, and 17 years of family law experience. She sat across from me in a conference room with a yellow legal pad and did not seem surprised by a single thing I told her. That steadiness, more than anything, was what I needed in that moment. Someone who had seen this before. Someone for whom this was not the end of the world, even if it felt like it was for me. She walked me through North Carolina divorce law with the kind of calm clarity that made my brain start working again. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state. Marital assets, including savings accumulated during the marriage, regardless of whose name was on the account, are subject to division. The transfers could potentially be considered dissipation of marital assets, especially if I could demonstrate they were used to fund an extramarital relationship. She told me to document everything. Every transfer, every date, every account. Then she said, "Do you have access to his email?" I did. We had shared passwords for years. Convenience, we'd told ourselves. The kind of small intimacy that builds up over a decade of living together. I went home that afternoon and spent 4 hours going through his email. What I found was worse than the money. There was a folder he had labeled Missy Property. Inside, it were emails from a real estate agent. Not from his company, but a private transaction. There was a property in Asheville, a small investment condo, purchased 14 months ago. Title in his name only. Mortgage payments coming out of a separate checking account I didn't know existed. One he had opened at a different bank almost 2 years before. He hadn't just been hiding a relationship. He had been building a separate financial life. Quietly. Systematically. For nearly 2 years. I photographed every screen. I forwarded every relevant email to a private address my sister helped me set up. I copied account numbers and dates and transaction records until my eyes burned. Then I closed the laptop, made myself a cup of tea, and sat very quietly with the understanding that the man I had been married to had been planning this for longer than I had known it was happening. The next morning, I went back to Miss Hollins with everything I'd found. She looked at the documents spread across her conference table and nodded slowly. "He's been preparing for this," she said. "I know," I said. "So will we." The weeks that followed were not easy. I won't pretend they were. There were nights when I lay awake, running through every conversation, every dinner, every anniversary trip, looking for the moments I had missed. There were mornings when I couldn't make myself get out of bed before 9. There were afternoons when I sat in my car in a parking lot and cried in a way I hadn't cried since my father passed. But there was also something else happening underneath all of that, something quieter and more determined. I started keeping a detailed log, every financial account I could access, every asset, every liability, every document I found. Ms. Hollins had also recommended a forensic accountant, a woman named Deborah, who specialized in exactly this kind of case. Deborah was small and precise and slightly terrifying in the best possible way. She went through our finances the way a surgeon goes through a body. Methodical, unhurried, looking for things that didn't belong. She found more. A second investment account that had been opened and used to route commissions from certain deals, a pattern of claimed business expenses that didn't line up with actual business activity, a consulting payment to an LLC that, when traced, turned out to be a company with no real operations that he had registered under a variation of his mother's maiden name. $43,000 from the joint savings was the visible part. The total was significantly larger. I remember sitting across from Deborah in her office while she walked me through the findings and feeling two things simultaneously. The grief of realizing the scale of it, and a very cold, very clear kind of resolve. He had spent 2 years building something without me. I was going to spend the next few months making sure that didn't disappear into thin air. Meanwhile, the social layer of our marriage was unraveling on its own. People talk. They always do. Mutual friends started reaching out. His version of events had been circulating, something vague about us, growing apart. About mutual unhappiness, about a decision they had both made together. I let it go for the first few weeks. I wasn't interested in managing his narrative. Then his sister called me. We had always been close. She lived in Atlanta, and we'd texted regularly for years. Birthday messages, occasional visits, the kind of easy warmth that builds up between women who married into the same family and genuinely like each other. She called me from her car, voice low, and said she needed to tell me something. She had known. Not everything, but enough. He had told her, months ago, that he was unhappy. He had told her he was seeing someone. He had asked her not to say anything. She said she was sorry. She said she should have called me sooner. She said she had told herself it wasn't her place, and she had been wrong. I told her I didn't blame her. And I meant it, mostly. She hadn't created the situation. She had just been caught in the loyalty trap that so many people fall into. The belief that staying silent is neutral, when it never really is. After we hung up, she called him. Whatever she said, I don't know exactly. But within 24 hours, 2 more people in our shared social circle had heard a version of the story that was closer to the truth. Not from me. From people who had decided they weren't interested in covering for him anymore. His reputation, which he had carefully managed, the way he managed everything, began to show its cracks. I heard through a mutual friend that the woman he had been seeing, the L from the text messages, had ended things around the time the divorce proceedings began. I can't say I was surprised. The version of himself he had sold her was built on the same architecture as the one he'd sold me. Controlled, curated, with the messy reality kept just out of sight. Once the legal process started, once the cracks became too wide to paper over, apparently that was more reality than she'd signed up for. I want to be careful here. I don't wish her harm. She may not have known, at least not at first. But I also won't pretend I felt nothing when I heard. The divorce took 11 months. Long enough to feel endless, short enough, in retrospect, given everything we were untangling. Ms. Hollins was steady throughout, strategic without being aggressive, thorough without being cruel. Deborah's findings formed the backbone of our argument for equitable distribution. The concealed assets, the Asheville condo, the LLC, the undisclosed accounts, All of it was documented, presented, and accounted for in the final settlement. In North Carolina, deliberate dissipation of marital assets is something courts take seriously. His careful architecture had not been careful enough. I won't disclose the exact terms. It wouldn't be appropriate, and honestly, it's not the point. The point is that when the process was over, I walked out with what was fair. Not what he had tried to arrange unilaterally. Not the diminished version of the future he had quietly prepared for me. What was actually, legally, equitably, mine. I kept the house. I had to buy out his share, which meant refinancing. And yes, that was stressful. And yes, there were 2 weeks in month 7 when I genuinely didn't know if the numbers were going to work. But they did. My name went on that mortgage alone, and I stood in the driveway afterward and felt something that took me a moment to identify. It was mine. All of it. Just mine. Biscuit was also mine. My husband hadn't contested that, which might be the most honest thing he did throughout the entire process. I started therapy 6 weeks after he moved out. I want to mention that because I think people sometimes treat it as a last resort, something you do when you've completely fallen apart. I wasn't completely falling apart. I was functioning. Going to work, feeding the dog, returning phone calls. But I was also carrying something I didn't have the vocabulary for yet, and I needed help finding the words. My therapist's name is Dr. Alicia Morrow. She has an office near Dilworth with plants on every windowsill, and a way of sitting in silence that somehow doesn't feel uncomfortable. She helped me understand something that took longer to absorb than I expected. The grief wasn't just about my husband. It was about the future I had believed in, the version of my life I had been building around a set of assumptions that turned out to be false. Losing a marriage is one thing. Losing the story you told yourself about your marriage is something different, and it needs to be grieved separately. Some days are still harder than others. I'm not going to tie this up too neatly, because that wouldn't be honest. There are still evenings when something small, a song, a smell, the way light hits the kitchen in the afternoon, pulls me back to before. I let it. I've learned not to fight those moments. They move through faster when I don't try to stop them. But there's also a version of my life now that I couldn't have seen from inside the marriage. I redecorated the living room. I took a solo trip to Savannah in the spring and spent 3 days wandering through the squares and eating shrimp and grits and not having to check in with anyone. I started running again, something I had dropped years ago because our schedules never seemed to align for it. I have dinner with my sister more than I used to. I call my mother on Sundays. Small things. But they're mine in a way that's difficult to explain to someone who hasn't had the experience of building a life so completely around another person that you lose track of who you are without them. I'm finding out. The man who hid a prepaid phone in his suit jacket thought he had managed the situation. He had prepared, planned, documented, arranged. He had been very deliberate about designing an exit that protected himself and left me with as little as possible. What he hadn't accounted for was that I am not someone who accepts the version of events other people try to hand me. Not without looking closer. Not without asking questions. Not without a sister who drives down from Raleigh with groceries and the right kind of anger, or an attorney with a yellow legal pad and 17 years of experience, or a forensic accountant who is slightly terrifying in exactly the right way. He thought he was leaving. He was. But he wasn't leaving on his terms. I think about that sometimes. The gap between the future he tried to engineer and the one that actually unfolded. He spent 2 years building something in secret, and in the end, what he built was the evidence that dismantled his own case. There's something almost symmetrical about that. Not satisfying, exactly. Not the closure people always say you're supposed to find. More like a kind of clarity. A clean line where there used to be fog. I was the woman who didn't notice. Or rather, I was the woman who noticed and chose to trust instead of investigate, which is not the same as being naive. It's being a person who believed in her marriage. I don't think I should have to apologize for that. What I know now is that belief by itself is not enough. You can love someone completely and still not know them fully. You can build 12 years of real, honest life with a person and still be standing in your kitchen one morning, holding proof that part of it was theater. That's the hardest thing to sit with. Not the betrayal, not the money, not even the lost years. The hardest thing is knowing that something can be real and false at the same time. That a life can be both things, simultaneously, without contradiction. But here's what I also know. I got up. I called people who helped me. I documented what I found. I let the process work. I asked for what was fair and I didn't apologize for asking. And when the dust settled, I was still standing in this house, with this dog at my feet, and these plants on the windowsill, and this quiet that is beginning, slowly, to feel less like absence and more like space. He lost someone who would have stayed through anything. I lost someone who was already gone. Only one of us is still paying for that.